The officer didn't even wait for the window to fully roll down. "Sir, step out of the vehicle." Dwight Calloway had been driving that road for 11 years. Same stretch of Route 9, heading out of Millfield, Georgia, same Tuesday morning, same beat-up but paid-off 2014 Chrysler 300 that his late wife, Renee, had picked out, because she said it made them look like they had somewhere important to be. He'd been taking his daughter Zoe to her orthodontist appointment. Zoe was 12. She had a retainer that needed adjusting and a social studies test third period she was already anxious about. None of that seemed to matter to the man now standing at his window, with one hand resting on his belt. "Lights and registration," the officer said, before Dwight had even finished stepping out. His name, according to the badge, was Officer T. Burrell. He looked to be about 26, maybe 27, broad shoulders, eyes that moved fast, scanning the interior of the car the way a man does when he's already decided he's found something and just hasn't located it yet. Dwight kept his hands visible. He always kept his hands visible. That was something his father had taught him. When he was 15 years old, the same summer he got his learner's permit, the same summer his father sat him down at the kitchen table in their house in Augusta and said, "When they stop you, and they will stop you, you keep your hands where they can see them. You say yes sir and no sir, you come home." Dwight had been following those instructions for 31 years. "Was I doing something wrong, officer?" he asked. His voice was level. He had practiced level. "We received a report of a vehicle matching this description in connection with a theft at a gas station on Clover Road about 5 minutes ago." Dwight looked at him. "A theft, that's correct. I've been on 285 since 7 this morning. I came from home. My daughter's in the back seat. She has an orthodontist appointment." Officer Burrell glanced at Zoe through the window. She was sitting very still with her backpack on her lap, and her eyes wide, and Dwight felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the fact that his little girl was watching this happen, and there was nothing he could do to make it not be happening. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step to the back of the vehicle. I'd like to know what I'm being detained for." "Sir, I'm not being combative," Dwight said carefully. "I'm asking a lawful question. What's the basis for this stop?" Burrell's jaw tightened. A second cruiser pulled up behind the first, and a second officer got out, older, heavier, moving with the particular slowness of a man who has never in his career been in a hurry about anything. His name tag said Sergeant D. Kettner. "What we got?" Kettner asked. "Suspect vehicle," Burrell said. "Drivers being uncooperative." Dwight had not raised his voice. He had not moved his hands. He had not done anything other than ask a question that the Constitution of the United States gave him every right to ask. But now he was uncooperative. "Sir," Kettner said, in a tone that suggested he had been disappointed by the world for a very long time, and Dwight was simply the latest in a series of disappointments. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Inside the car, Zoe pressed her forehead against the window. Her breath made a small fog circle on the glass. Dwight thought about his wife. He thought about Renee lying in that hospital bed 3 years ago, and the way she had gripped his hand and said, "You take care of our girl, Dwight. You make sure she sees the world right." He thought about how he had been trying, every single day since, to figure out exactly what that meant. What it meant to show your daughter the world, right when the world kept showing her things like this. He stepped to the back of the vehicle. He put his hands on the trunk. He said yes sir and no sir. He came home, but not before it got worse. The gas station theft turned out to be a missing carton of cigarettes, $42. The vehicle in the alleged report was a blue sedan. Dwight's car was black. The description of the suspect was a man in a red jacket. Dwight was wearing a gray polo he'd had since 2019, the one with the small bleach stain on the cuff that Zoe always teased him about. None of this was mentioned in the 45 minutes Dwight stood at the back of his car, while Officer Burrell ran his plates, ran his license, called something in on his radio, walked a slow circle around the Chrysler, peered in the windows, asked Zoe her name, asked Zoe where they were going, asked Zoe if she knew the man outside was her father. Zoe had looked at the officer, with the particular expression that 12-year-old girls reserve for adults, who have said something deeply stupid. "He's my dad," she said. "I've known him my whole life." At some point, Burrell came back to where Dwight was standing and said, in the tone of a man delivering good news, "We're going to let you go." Dwight looked at him. You're going to let me go? That's right. I haven't done anything. That's correct. So you're not letting me go? Dwight said, still in that level practiced voice. You're acknowledging that I was free to go the entire time. Something moved behind Burrell's eyes, something that wasn't quite anger, and wasn't quite embarrassment, and was probably a mix of both. Have a good day, sir, he said, and walked back to his cruiser. Dwight sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the car. Zoe was quiet in the back. Then she said, Dad. Yeah, baby. That wasn't right. No, he said, it wasn't. Are you going to do something about it? He looked at her in the rearview mirror. She had Renee's eyes, that same particular directness, the kind that didn't ask questions so much as issue quiet demands. He thought about what he was going to say next, because he understood that she would remember it. Children always remember the things you say in the car. I'm going to think about it, he told her. He already knew what he was going to do. Dwight Calloway had been a civil engineer for 22 years. He had a master's degree from Georgia Tech, and his name on 3 infrastructure patents, and a reputation in Millfield for being the man you called when the math on a bridge project wasn't adding up. He coached Zoe's soccer team Saturday mornings. He made a green chili that had won the church cook-off 4 years running. He was the kind of man that people in his neighborhood called steady. The word that gets applied to black men who never seem rattled, not because they aren't, but because they have learned, over decades, that the cost of seeming rattled is usually much higher than the cost of staying calm. He had been steady for so long that people sometimes forgot it took effort. He drove Zoe to her appointment. He sat in the waiting room and answered emails. He drove her to school with a note explaining the delay. He picked up coffee, he went to work. He did all of this the way he always did, thoroughly, without visible disturbance. And then he sat in his office with the door closed and he wrote down everything he remembered about the stop, the time, the badge numbers, the cruiser plate numbers, the exact words Officer Burrell had used, the exact words Sergeant Kettner had used. He wrote it all down in the same precise methodical way. He wrote up a structural assessment, because that was what this was. An assessment. A record. Then he made a phone call. His brother-in-law, Curtis, was not someone Dwight called often. They were not close in the way that some brothers-in-law are close. Curtis had been Renee's younger brother, and their relationship had always been mediated by her. She was the warm center of that family, the translator between people who loved each other, but spoke different languages. After she died, Dwight and Curtis had stayed in contact out of shared grief and shared love for Zoe and not much else. But Curtis was a captain in the United States Army, currently stationed at Fort Stewart, 45 minutes south of Millfield, and he had 3 days off coming. I heard what happened, Curtis said, when Dwight finished talking. Word gets around. Zoe called me this morning from school. She was pretty upset. Dwight closed his eyes briefly. 12 years old, calling her uncle from the bathroom between classes. That image sat in his chest like a stone. I need to file a formal complaint, Dwight said. I need to do this right. Document everything, file with the department, file with the Civilian Oversight Board, but I also need a witness, someone who can come with me, who they can't dismiss. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. I'll be there Thursday, Curtis said. On Thursday morning, Officer Burrell was in the middle of his usual 8 a.m. briefing, when the desk sergeant came in and told him there was a man outside asking for the duty officer. 2 men actually. One of them was wearing civilian clothes, the other was in Army dress uniform, the kind that has rows of ribbons on it, and tends to make rooms go quiet when it walks in. Burrell didn't know that yet. He was still in the briefing room, drinking bad coffee. The duty officer that morning was Lieutenant Aaron Spence, who had been with the Millfield PD for 16 years, and had, over that time, developed a finely calibrated sense for when something was about to become a problem. He had that sense very strongly now, standing across the front counter from Dwight Calloway and Captain Curtis Wayland of the United States Army. Dwight placed a folder on the counter. It was neat. Tabbed. He had clearly put time into it. My name is Dwight Calloway, he said. On Tuesday, September the 12th, I was stopped on Route 9 by Officers Burrell and Kettner. I was detained for 45 minutes without cause. My 12-year-old daughter was present. I'm here to file a formal complaint and request a copy of the dashcam and bodycam footage from that stop. Spence looked at the folder. He looked at Curtis, who was standing slightly to Dwight's left with his hands clasped and his expression completely neutral. There were 5 ribbons on Curtis's left breast. There was a combat infantryman badge. There was the quiet, unmistakable posture of a man who has stood in much harder rooms than this one, and found them manageable. "I'll need to," Spence started. "I have the badge numbers," Dwight said, "the cruiser plate numbers, the approximate time of the stop, and the names of 2 witnesses other than my daughter. I also have a letter from my attorney, indicating that if the footage from this stop is not preserved and provided in response to my FOIA request, we will be seeking sanctions." The room was very quiet. Spence took the folder. What happened next did not happen quickly. That matters to say, because the stories we tell about moments like this tend to compress the timeline, make the justice feel sudden and clean, when really it was slow and grinding, and required Dwight to send 14 follow-up emails and make 6 phone calls and sit through 2 meetings with the Civilian Oversight Board and provide his account 3 separate times to 3 separate sets of people, each of whom took notes and said they would be in touch and were not always in touch as promptly as they said. But it happened. The dashcam footage showed no traffic violation, no erratic driving, no rolling stop, nothing that would constitute a lawful basis for the stop. The bodycam footage, Burrell's bodycam, showed the 45-minute detention. It showed Burrell asking Zoe if she knew the man outside was her father. It showed Dwight's hands on the trunk of his car for the duration. It showed the exact exchange about being let go. The Civilian Oversight Board found that the stop lacked reasonable articulable suspicion. They found that Officer Burrell's conduct during the detention was inconsistent with department policy. They recommended disciplinary review and mandatory retraining. They also recommended, and this was the part that got picked up by the local paper, that Sergeant Kettner's supervisory conduct during the incident be reviewed separately, given that he arrived on scene, assessed the situation, and elected to escalate rather than de-escalate. Kettner filed for early retirement 2 weeks later. Burrell was suspended without pay for 30 days, and placed on a performance improvement plan. The department issued a public statement acknowledging that the stop had not met constitutional standards, and expressing regret for the experience of the Calloway family. Dwight read the statement sitting at his kitchen table. Zoe was doing homework across from him. The kitchen still had the yellow curtains Renee had chosen, the ones with the small embroidered sunflowers along the hem. "They apologized," Zoe said. She had been reading over his shoulder. "They issued a statement," Dwight said. "Is that different?" He thought about it. "It's a start," he said. "It's not the same as it never happening, but it's a start." Zoe was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Uncle Curtis called it a reckoning." Dwight smiled, just a little. "Curtis watches a lot of television. He said you were brave." "I filed paperwork," Dwight said. "Anyone can file paperwork." "Not everyone does," Zoe said, and went back to her homework. He sat with that for a while. Outside a car passed on the street, then another, and the kitchen was the particular quiet of a house that has learned to be quiet, that carries its absences the way old wood carries the shape of the nails that used to be in it. Renee had been gone 3 years. Some days it felt like a long time. Some days it felt like a Tuesday. He folded the newspaper, he got up and started dinner. The story might have ended there. Dwight Calloway, a steady man, filed paperwork, achieved accountability, went home. That would be enough. That would be more than a lot of people get. But 2 months later, the Millfield City Council announced that they were forming a task force on traffic stop policies in the county, with a particular focus on documented disparities in who gets stopped, how long they're detained, and what outcomes follow. They were looking for a civilian co-chair. Someone with credibility in the community. Someone methodical. Someone who could look at data and turn it into something a room full of people could understand. They called Dwight. He said he needed to think about it. He called Curtis, who said, "Obviously you're going to do it." He called his neighbor Barbara, who had lived next to the Calloways for 14 years, and had watched Zoe grow up, and still brought food over sometimes. "Just because," she said, "Dwight, you have been training for this your entire life." He talked to Zoe last. He sat on the edge of her bed the way he had since she was small, when she was afraid of things she couldn't name, and he would sit in the dark and just be present. He told her what they were asking him to do, and what it would mean in terms of time, and that he wanted to know what she thought. Zoe thought about it with the seriousness she applied to most things. You said doing something about it wasn't just about you, she said. You said it was about the next person. I said something like that. Yeah. Then you already know the answer. He did. He had known it since Tuesday morning on Route 9, standing with his hands on the trunk of the car, while his daughter watched through the window. He had known it in the specific way that you know things that you haven't yet admitted to yourself. The knowing that lives just below the surface, waiting for someone to give it permission to come up. He accepted the appointment. Here is what the data showed. Once Dwight and the task force spent 3 months pulling it together. Black drivers in Millfield County were stopped at a rate 2.5 times higher than white drivers in the same traffic corridors. They were detained for an average of 31 minutes longer per stop. They were significantly less likely to receive a citation, meaning the stops, more often than not, resulted in nothing: no ticket, no infraction, no cause. Just time. Just standing on the side of the road with your hands visible while your daughter watched. The task force presented these findings to the city council in February, in a room that was standing room only, with a crowd that included pastors and school board members, and retired officers, and young men who had pulled out their phones to record, and older women who sat with their hands folded, and their jaws set in the way of people who have known this for a long time, and are not surprised by the numbers, but are still wounded by seeing them in print. Dwight presented the findings himself. He stood at the podium, and he was, as he always was, level. But those who knew him well, Curtis in the back row, Barbara near the door, Zoe in the third seat from the left in the fourth row, wearing the blue sweater, could see something underneath the level. Something that had been there since a Tuesday morning, when a man named Burrell had told him to step out of the vehicle before the window was even down. He presented the data. He presented the recommendations. He answered questions for 90 minutes without notes. When a council member asked if he thought these findings reflected intentional bias or systemic issues, Dwight said, "I think the distinction matters less than the outcome. The person standing on the side of the road doesn't experience a systemic issue. They experience 45 minutes. They experience their daughter's face at the window. The question isn't just why it's happening. The question is what we're going to do about it now that we know." The council voted unanimously to implement the task force recommendations. Afterward in the parking lot, Curtis shook his hand and said, "Renee would have loved this." Dwight looked at him. His throat did something that required a moment to manage. "Yeah," he said. "She would have been insufferable about it. She'd have taken full credit." Curtis laughed, and for a moment he sounded exactly like his sister, and the parking lot was cold, and the night was clear, and Dwight Calloway stood there in it, and felt, for the first time in a long time, like the weight he had been carrying had not gotten lighter. It never gets lighter, grief and responsibility don't work that way. But that he had gotten stronger. Zoe appeared at his side and leaned against his arm. She didn't say anything. She was 12 and she had just watched her father stand in front of a room full of people and be unafraid. He put his arm around her shoulders and they walked to the car. There are approximately 50,000 traffic stops made in this country every day. Most of them end without incident, some of them don't. The difference, too often, is not what the driver did, it's who the driver is. Dwight Calloway didn't set out to become a civic figure. He set out to take his daughter to an orthodontist appointment. He set out to keep his hands visible, and say yes sir, and come home. He did everything right the way his father taught him, the way fathers have been teaching sons in this country for generations. Not because it's right that they have to, but because it has been necessary. What changed, this time, was that he also wrote it down. Every reform, every policy shift, every piece of data that makes someone in a council chamber say we need to do better. It started with someone who refused to let a Tuesday morning become just another Tuesday morning. It started with a man who had practiced levels his whole life, and decided, on a quiet stretch of Route 9, that level wasn't the same as silent. His daughter is 13 now. She still has the retainer. She still worries about social studies tests, though she's gotten better at hiding it. She has started, on her own, keeping a small notebook by her bed. For ideas, she says, when her father asks. For things she wants to remember. She is her mother's daughter, she is her father's daughter, she is watching everything, and she is taking notes.